So now let's examine some of the underlying principles of participation in museums, as well as in museum learning. It's actually an idea that's pretty old, and so old that it's new. But why encourage participation in learning in museums? So not just because the museum itself, or the book itself, is talking about museums as participatory venues, and we're expanding this into education as the primary form of participation. So when Nina Simon wrote that text, it was seen as a somewhat innovative and bold new idea that gave some people the willies, particularly if you're a conservator, because it conjures up images of people coming in and touching everything. But that isn't how it has to be. And when we're looking at culture centers with a lot of Native American communities, we find out actually that the logic behind Nina Simon's text makes total sense if we're looking at being a cultural accelerator and accelerated learning for cultural maintenance and continuity, as well as educating others about culture. So what participation does is that it gives a sense of personal efficacy. What efficacy means is someone's sense of control, personal control, not only over themselves, but of events around them. And this is important in a learning process, that people are engaged in learning rather having learning done to them. It implies then an active engagement, because it's a choice among many that an individual can make in any culture-based institution setting they choose to enter. So participation also encourages interaction and learning, that learners become agents in their own experience, so they're acting on behalf of themselves in their experience. They're making choices that benefit themselves in their experience, because visitation is a choice among many alternatives. So it doesn't even hurt to say that this experience could be fun, that we could turn education into edutainment, and without denigrating, without lessening the import of either. So there's a big question involved here. How can cultural institutions use participatory techniques not just to give visitors a voice, but to develop experiences that are more valuable and compelling for everyone? In other words, by encouraging people to participate more in museums, how can their own experiences become those that others can learn from? And this is then when we start to look at the learning experience going full circle, because the learner has come into the institution has assisted, has guided in the learning experience, and then that experience itself is translated and transmitted to others who in essence come through hopefully and do the same thing. This is a somewhat new model of museum education, because it puts a lot more onus on the part of the visitors too. So we look at questions of design then, not only in architecture, design, and layout of museums, but in exhibitions themselves, and even in the supplementary materials that museums produce. Because at the center of a design process, in an educational and a participatory process, how do we promote dialogue, not only between the museum and the individuals, or the museum and the collection, but the individuals and the collection, the individuals and the museum, and the individuals with other individuals. So how do we promote creativity and expression through the efforts that we promote, that we endeavor to fulfill with museum visitors? How do we promote shared learning? And that shared learning being between the visitors and the museum, the visitors and each other. And then how do we promote co-creative work? Creativity is a learning process. Co-creativity is just as much a learning process, with an underlying motivation that several minds working together can produce better solutions, better ideas, as compared to too many cooks spoil the broth. It really does, in a very large way, depend on how we want to view the creative process, and the creative process as part of a learning process. Now, traditional exhibit design isn't necessarily flawed. But there has been a focus on consistent as well as high quality content that's being produced for visitors. And also within traditional exhibit design has been the philosophy that every visitor is going to experience the content the same way, ideally excellent, and then the content itself is understood in exactly the same way that the planners hoped it would be understood. But as we mentioned already, that if every individual experiences a museum differently, that we come from so many diverse backgrounds, so many diverse levels of experience, that no one is going to experience it exactly the same way. So how do we look at this diversity as a strength, as part of a learning process, as well as an educational process? So with learning in museums then, we're going to look at learning in museums as compared to museum education. Learning in museums is visitor-centered. Museum education is museum-centered. So there's going to be an interaction then between the two. So it's not an either-or, but let's try to think of it as an and, because it's typically been seen as the either-or. And we want to really see this more inclusive. So this means that there's going to be different kinds of interactions, or let's call them conversations, that are occurring. And the conversations aren't always spoken, they're not always out loud. But there is a conversation then of the visitor to the museum, the visitor to the exhibit, the visitor to the objects and those reference, as well as visitor to visitor. We mentioned this in the previous lesson. But it's not only the visitor to a museum then, because we are looking at it also, if we're doing this inclusively with part of museum education, not or museum education, but and museum education, that we can do these same types of translations. So we start to understand that there are actually many different channels that are occurring of communication, many different messages that are being sent through many different individuals with many different effects. And this is all something that can be incorporated into the learning experience in a museum. So if we were to think about participatory design, and think about this as you start to engage in your semester projects, because your semester projects are only going to be toward one type of project. If you were to translate what you do into different forums, how would you do this? So with participatory design, we see the institution itself then as a platform that is going to connect users. It's a place that people are going to come and stand and be assisted in their connections with others. That we view users as creators of content, as distributors of content, as consumers of content, as critics of content, as collaborators, as well as learners. So that we are going to be having an output of very diverse, co-produced experiences that other people are going to take in. This means that we involve the learners in the process, and that every visitor can contribute legitimately to the museum. One of the places that that study has been done in this very thing, in this very idea, has been, for example, YouTube, where people not only create the content, but other people can they can link their videos to those videos that have been uploaded. They can comment on them, and they can also send them to others, or they can produce ideas or suggest ideas that the particular content creators could try out. And so we've seen there's a lot of crap on YouTube, but there's actually some pretty good stuff that was a result of this participatory design, co-creation, in a common format, with YouTube then as the platform. But this could be translated into museums, and it does not have to be with digital media. And actually, Nina Simon talks about that, where there was a kiosk where people come up and they say things to the kiosk. And you find out if it's random like that, really no one gains, and no one knows why even they're doing it. So some of the fundamental changes that would have to occur then in our thinking, as well as in some of the institutions within which we work, and this includes culture centers that are in Indian communities right now, as well as Australian Aboriginal or New Zealand or Irian Jaya, other tribal peoples in the world. That because it has been a fact that often when museums or culture centers have been started, to replace the ones that were there from colonizing powers. All that occurred is that brown faces or dark faces replaced the lighter ones, and yet the institution itself was largely unchanged. So some of these changes are institutional. So it means there has to be some degree of power sharing. In other words, that means that learners who come to the museum, if we're looking at efficacy, personal control, some of the power has to be shared with them so they feel as if they have some degree of control. There have to be higher levels of interactivity. One notion that has been put forward in part of increasing interactivity has been a totally open museum, and it's an almost open collection museum where all of the holdings of the museum are open for people to interact with. This really drives conservators and registrars crazy. That we have to trust visitor abilities as creators of meaningful content in learning experience. That we have to be open to growth and change, and that we have to be fluid and changeable. We have to understand ideas are going to be going beyond the institution's intent. And how can we modify sometimes the ideas to fit the institution's intent, or how can we modify the institution's intent to fit the museum or the ideas that are being produced by learners as part of this overall participatory process. And you're going to hear this word again and again: participation, participatory, power sharing, efficacy, interactivity. And this is how museums are going to remain relevant in individuals as well as communities' lives. So how can this be done? How can we make more objects available? This can be done through replications or replicas of or models of objects that are already in the collections, so that the originals are not destroyed. It could be done with digitization of some objects and images. It could be done with utilization of social media. These are only some of the ways that we can start to make more of collection available for people to enhance their learning experiences.